welcome to Myths and Slumber. Tonight, we explore the legendary tales of Anansi, the clever spider god who outwitted kings and gods alike across West Africa. His web of cunning tricks brought wisdom to humanity itself. If ancient myths are your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let the ancient stories carry you to sleep. Allow your breathing to slow and deepen, like the gentle rhythm of waves upon distant shores. Feel the weight of your day dissolving into the warm embrace of twilight. In this sacred space between waking and sleeping, between the known and the mysterious, we prepare to enter a realm where wisdom wears the mask of mischief, where the smallest creature can outwit the mightiest god, and where every thread in the cosmic web connects us to stories older than memory itself. Anansi, whose name means spider in the Akan language, whose 8 legs have carried him across oceans of time, whose web stretches from the earthbound villages of Ghana to the star-scattered heavens where the sky god dwells. He is trickster and teacher, fool and philosopher, the keeper of all stories that have ever been told and all stories yet to come. Tonight, as darkness settles like a gentle blanket across the land, we follow the silk threads of Anansi's web back to the very beginning, back to when the world was young and malleable, when wisdom had a price, and when a humble spider dared to challenge the gods themselves for the greatest treasure of all, the stories that make us human. In the time before time, when the world was nothing more than a whispered possibility in the mind of the divine, there existed only the vast emptiness of potential and the patient presence of Niam, the sky god, whose breath would become the wind and whose thoughts would become the stars. The earth below lay barren and silent, waiting for the touch that would awaken it to life, waiting for the stories that would give meaning to existence itself. It was in this primordial stillness that Anansi first spun his web. Not a web of silk and dewdrops as mortals would later know, but a web of pure possibility, each strand a pathway between what was and what could be. From his place in the cosmic void, this ancient spider began to weave the very fabric of reality, his 8 legs moving in perfect rhythm, creating patterns that would one day become the foundation of all creation stories, all wisdom tales, all the narratives that bind communities together like threads in an eternal tapestry. Anansi was not born as other creatures were born. He emerged from the intersection of chaos and order, from the place where laughter meets tears, where wisdom dances with folly. His body, no larger than a child's palm, contained multitudes, the cunning of 1,000 foxes, the patience of the ancient mountains, the curiosity that would one day drive humans to reach for the stars themselves. His 8 eyes saw not just what was before him, but what lay hidden beneath, what existed in the spaces between thoughts, in the pause between heartbeats. The other primordial beings took notice of this strange, small creature whose ambitions seemed to stretch far beyond his humble appearance. Niam himself, from his throne among the clouds, watched with growing interest as Anansi's web began to intersect with the dreams that would become mountains, rivers, and forests. There was something different about this spider, something that set him apart from the other creatures who accepted their place in the natural order without question. Anansi possessed what would later be recognized as the most dangerous trait of all. He asked questions. Why should the sky god alone possess all wisdom? Why should stories belong only to those who ruled from on high? Why should the small and seemingly powerless accept their fate without challenge? These questions hummed through his web like music, creating vibrations that reached into every corner of the emerging universe. As the world took shape around him, Anansi observed the careful hierarchy that Niam established. The great cosmic serpent would encircle the earth, holding it steady in the vast ocean of space. The sun would travel his appointed path across the sky, never varying from his course. The rivers would flow always toward the sea, the seasons would follow their eternal cycle, and all creatures would know their place in the grand design. It was a beautiful order, perfect in its symmetry, peaceful in its predictability. But Anansi saw something missing from this divine arrangement. Where was the spark of unpredictability that made life truly alive? Where was the laughter that came from outwitting a stronger opponent? Where was the satisfaction of turning disadvantage into triumph through cleverness rather than strength? Most importantly, where were the stories that would help mortals understand not just what they should do, but why they should do it? In those early days, before humans walked the earth, before even the great beasts roamed the savannas, Anansi began to practice his craft. He would approach the other creatures with seemingly innocent proposals, challenges disguised as games, tests that revealed hidden truths about strength and weakness, wisdom and foolishness. The mighty elephant, so proud of his size, found himself trapped in a web of words, forced to admit that bulk was not always better than brains. The swift antelope, confident in her speed, discovered that sometimes the longest path led most surely to the destination. Each victory, each clever solution to an impossible problem, added another strand to Anansi's growing reputation. Word of his exploits traveled on the wind, carried by the birds who witnessed his tricks, whispered by the trees who sheltered him during his adventures. Soon, creatures from across the emerging world began to seek him out, some hoping to learn from his methods, others determined to expose him as a fraud. All of them became threads in the ever-expanding web of stories that surrounded the spider like a shimmering aureole. But Anansi's greatest ambition lay elsewhere. High above, in the realm of eternal light where Niam held court among the thunder clouds and rainbow bridges, lay the treasure that the spider desired above all others. Not gold, for what use had a spider for precious metals? Not power in the conventional sense, for he had no desire to rule over others. What Anansi wanted was far more valuable and far more dangerous. He wanted the stories. All the stories that had ever been told or ever could be told were kept in a great calabash gourd in Niam's palace. Within that vessel swirled the tales of heroes and cowards, lovers and enemies, victories and defeats that gave meaning to existence. These were not mere entertainment, but the very essence of wisdom itself, the accumulated understanding of how to live well, how to face hardship, how to find hope in despair and humility in triumph. They were the inheritance that belonged, Anansi believed, not to the gods alone but to all creatures who had the wit to use them wisely. The other inhabitants of the early world thought Anansi's ambition was madness. How could a creature so small challenge the sky god himself? How could 8 thin legs carry what was meant to remain forever in the heavens? They underestimated the spider's greatest weapon, not his strength, for he had little, not his speed, for others were swifter, but his understanding that every problem, no matter how impossible it seemed, had a solution waiting for the mind clever enough to find it. And so Anansi began to spin, not just webs to catch flies, but plans to catch wisdom itself. Each strand of his plotting connected to another, creating a network of possibilities that stretched from earth to sky, from the realm of mortals to the throne of gods. He knew that direct confrontation would fail, that pleading would be ignored, that bargaining would be refused. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was another way, a spider's way, patient, subtle, and absolutely certain of success. The web was ready. The stage was set. And somewhere in the vast palace of the sky, Niam's calabash of stories began to hum with anticipation, as if the tales within sensed that their long imprisonment was about to end, that they were about to find their way into the world where they belonged, carried on the back of the most unlikely hero of all, a small spider with enormous dreams and the cunning to make those dreams reality. High above the newly formed earth, where clouds gathered like courtiers around a celestial throne and lightning served as royal messengers, stretched the magnificent palace of Niam, the sky god. Its walls were built from crystallized starlight, its foundations rested upon the solid certainty of divine will, and its towers reached so far into the cosmic heights that their peaks disappeared into realms where even immortals feared to venture. Here, in halls that echoed with the music of the spheres, Niam held dominion over all creation, his word the law that governed everything from the orbit of planets to the blooming of flowers in distant meadows. In the deepest vault of his palace, protected by locks made of solidified moonbeams and guards whose eyes were fallen stars, Niam kept his most precious possession. The great calabash of stories sat upon a pedestal of polished meteorite, its surface smooth as still water, dark as the space between galaxies. Within this vessel, invisible to ordinary sight but radiant with spiritual energy, swirled all the tales that gave meaning to existence. Stories of courage that could inspire the cowardly to heroism, tales of love that could heal broken hearts, narratives of wisdom that could guide the lost back to their true paths. The stories were not static things, mere words preserved in amber. They lived and breathed within their calabash prison, growing richer with each passing eon, developing new layers of meaning as the universe itself matured. Sometimes, late at night when the palace slept, Niam would visit this chamber and listen to the soft murmur of tales telling themselves to each other, an endless conversation of narrative threads weaving together into ever more complex patterns of significance. It was beautiful music, but music meant for divine ears alone. The sky god believed deeply in order, in the proper place of things. Just as the sun rose in the east and set in the west, just as rivers flowed toward the sea and plants reached toward the light, there was a correct hierarchy to wisdom and its distribution. The gods possessed knowledge because they had the perspective to use it wisely, the eternal viewpoint necessary to see how individual actions rippled outward through time and space. Mortals, when they eventually came to exist, would receive what wisdom they needed through proper channels: priests who maintained sacred traditions, elders who preserved ancient customs, rulers who carried the burden of divine mandate. The idea that stories should be scattered freely through the world, available to any creature clever enough to claim them, struck Niam as profoundly dangerous. What would happen if tales of rebellion fell into the wrong hands? What chaos might result if stories meant to teach patience were misinterpreted as lessons in passivity? How could the delicate balance of creation be maintained if every spider and antelope and human could access the same narrative wisdom that guided the gods themselves? No, far better to keep the stories safe, protected, distributed with careful discrimination when and where they might do good rather than harm. But even as Niam maintained his celestial court in perfect order, whispers began to reach his ears of a small creature making large waves in the world below. The other gods brought him reports of Anansi's exploits with a mixture of amusement and concern. Here was a spider who refused to accept the limitations of his size and species, who approached problems with a creativity that bordered on the revolutionary, who seemed to operate by rules entirely of his own devising. Most disturbing of all, this Anansi appeared to possess an intuitive understanding of storytelling that rivaled even the divine comprehension. For Niam, in his divine wisdom, recognized something his advisors missed. Anansi represented not physical danger but conceptual challenge, not revolution through force but transformation through example. The spider's greatest weapon was not his cleverness alone but his willingness to use that cleverness to question assumptions that others accepted without thought. He was, in essence, the living embodiment of the idea that intelligence and determination could overcome any obstacle, that established order was not synonymous with eternal necessity. Such ideas, once released into the world, had a way of taking root and growing in directions their originators never intended. The sky god found himself in an unusual position. His divine nature compelled him to maintain cosmic order, to preserve the careful balance that kept creation stable and harmonious. Yet his wisdom also recognized the value of change, growth, and the kind of creative disruption that prevented stagnation. Anansi, for all his presumption, served a necessary function in the great web of existence. The spider's challenges forced other creatures to think more deeply, to examine their assumptions, to grow beyond the comfortable limitations they had accepted. The question was not whether Anansi should be stopped, but how his essential nature could be channeled in directions that served the greater good. As these thoughts occupied the sky god's attention, far below in the earthly realm, Anansi was putting the finishing touches on his most ambitious plan yet. The spider had spent countless days observing the patterns of divine behavior, noting when the gods were most and least attentive, identifying the routes by which messages traveled between earth and heaven. He had studied the weaknesses of seemingly invulnerable beings, the blind spots in apparently all-seeing vision, the cracks in what appeared to be perfect armor. Most importantly, he had begun to understand the fundamental nature of wisdom itself, not as a possession to be hoarded but as a force that achieved its true power only when it flowed freely through the world, touching every creature capable of receiving it. The calabash of stories, sitting in its vault of starlight and moonbeam locks, began to resonate with a frequency just beyond the range of divine hearing. The tales within seemed to sense that their time of liberation was approaching, that soon they would burst forth from their celestial prison to find homes in the hearts and minds of creatures throughout creation. They whispered to each other in languages older than words, preparing themselves for the great diaspora that would scatter them like seeds across the fertile ground of imagination. Some stories trembled with excitement, others with trepidation, but all of them recognized that they were about to become part of something far larger than their individual narratives. They were about to become the shared inheritance of all thinking beings. In his throne room of crystallized light, Niam felt the shift in cosmic harmony like a musician sensing a string about to snap. The ordered universe was approaching a point of transformation, a moment when the careful equilibrium of millennia would be challenged by a force no larger than the palm of a child's hand yet more determined than the tide itself. The sky god settled more deeply into his throne and prepared to witness either the greatest folly in the history of creation, or the birth of something entirely new in the relationship between wisdom and those who sought it. Either way, he suspected, the universe would never be quite the same again. The morning when Anansi began his ascent to the realm of the sky god dawned with unusual clarity, as if the very air itself had been polished to crystalline transparency by the magnitude of what was about to unfold. The spider moved with deliberate purpose along the silver thread of his web, each step carrying him higher into the atmosphere where earthbound creatures feared to venture. Behind him stretched the world he knew, forests thick with the chatter of birds, rivers that wound like serpents through grasslands, villages where humans would one day gather around fires to share the very stories he sought to liberate. Ahead lay the unknown realm of divine power, where his small size and humble origins would count for nothing against the cosmic forces arrayed before him. As Anansi climbed through layers of cloud and mist, his 8 legs working with tireless precision, he rehearsed the words he would speak to Niam. He understood that direct confrontation would fail instantly. No creature, however clever, could hope to defeat the sky god through force or intimidation. Similarly, appeals to emotion would likely fall on deaf ears. Divine beings operated according to principles far grander and more complex than simple compassion. What remained was the path Anansi knew best, the way of the puzzle, the challenge that appeared impossible but concealed within itself the very key to its solution. The spider's plan was audacious in its simplicity. He would challenge Niam to prove his own divine wisdom by setting a task so difficult that no mortal creature could hope to complete it. The sky god, confident in his superiority and perhaps amused by the presumption of such a small supplicant, would set conditions that seemed to guarantee Anansi's failure. But the spider had spent long months studying the nature of divine psychology, and he suspected that gods, like all intelligent beings, possessed certain predictable blind spots, areas where their very perfection made them unable to anticipate the solutions that imperfection might devise. The palace of Niam materialized around Anansi like a dream becoming solid. Walls of starlight stretched in all directions, their surfaces reflecting images of distant galaxies and cosmic phenomena beyond mortal comprehension. The floor beneath the spider's feet hummed with contained energy, each tile a miniature sun held in perfect suspension. Guards made of crystallized lightning stood at attention along the corridors, their eyes tracking the small intruder with expressions of bemused curiosity rather than hostility. Even in this realm of infinite power, Anansi appeared more as an amusing oddity than a genuine threat. The throne room of the sky god defied all attempts at description, for it existed in dimensions that earthly language could not encompass. Anansi found himself in a space that was simultaneously vast as an ocean and intimate as a cocoon, where distance and proximity operated according to rules that shifted with the observer's state of mind. At the center of this impossible geometry sat Niam himself, a figure whose presence filled every corner of existence while remaining somehow approachable and finite. The sky god's attention focused on his unexpected visitor with the weight of cosmic curiosity, as if the spider were a fascinating puzzle that had wandered into his domain. The sky god's laughter was like the music of solar winds passing through asteroid fields, beautiful and alien and tinged with genuine amusement. "You propose to test me, little spider? You, whose entire existence spans but the briefest moment in cosmic time, would measure your wit against one who witnessed the birth of stars and will observe their final extinction? This is either the greatest courage I have ever witnessed or the most profound foolishness. Perhaps both." The divine eyes, each one containing swirling galaxies of light, fixed upon Anansi with renewed interest. "I propose nothing so presumptuous," Anansi replied carefully. "Rather, I ask only for the opportunity to earn what I seek through the completion of tasks you yourself design. Set before me challenges that you deem appropriate for one who would claim the stories of the world. If I fail, I will return to my web and never again presume upon your divine attention. But if I succeed, if somehow these 8 thin legs can carry me through trials crafted by cosmic wisdom itself, then perhaps the stories belong not in a calabash but in the world where they can grow and flourish and serve their true purpose." The request hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning impossible distances. Niam considered the spider before him, seeing not just the small creature that had dared to climb to heaven, but the principle he represented, the idea that wisdom belonged not just to those powerful enough to hoard it but to any being willing to pay its true price. The sky god understood the implications of what Anansi proposed far better than the spider himself realized. This was not merely a test of cleverness, but a fundamental challenge to the cosmic order, a question about whether divine prerogatives could be earned rather than simply inherited. "First," announced Niam, "you must bring me Osibo the leopard, mightiest of all the great cats, whose claws can rend the fabric of reality itself and whose roar can shatter mountains. He must come willingly, bound not by force but by his own acknowledgement of your superiority." As the sky god spoke, an image of the great leopard materialized in the air, a creature of terrible beauty whose spotted coat seemed to contain all the shadows of the world, whose golden eyes held the concentrated essence of predatory perfection. Anansi listened to each challenge with growing excitement rather than despair. Where others might see impossible obstacles, the spider saw puzzles waiting for creative solutions. Each task, despite its apparent difficulty, contained within itself the very elements necessary for its completion. The leopard's pride, the hornet's territorial nature, the fairy's connection to natural harmony, all of these could become allies rather than enemies for one clever enough to approach them properly. Niam nodded his consent, already curious to see how this small creature would approach challenges that had been designed to test the limits of possibility itself. "1 year you shall have," the sky god agreed. "When the same stars shine in the same positions as they do today, return to this place with your prizes, or return with nothing but the wisdom that comes from acknowledging one's limitations." As Anansi began his descent back to the earthly realm, the calabash of stories seemed to pulse with anticipation in its distant vault. The tales within sensed that their liberation hung in the balance, dependent upon the success of the most unlikely hero who had ever sought to claim them. They whispered encouragement into the cosmic winds, sending their subtle support to the small spider who carried their hopes on his 8 determined legs. The greatest adventure in the history of storytelling had begun, and its outcome would determine whether wisdom remained forever locked in celestial vaults or found its way into the waiting hearts of all creation. The descent from Niam's celestial palace carried Anansi through layers of atmosphere that grew thicker and more familiar with each passing moment. Below him, the earth spread out like a vast tapestry woven from every shade of green imaginable, broken by the silver threads of rivers and the golden patches of sun-drenched grasslands. Somewhere in that magnificent wilderness prowled Osibo the leopard, the first and perhaps most dangerous of the creatures the spider must somehow persuade to accompany him back to the realm of the sky god. As his 8 legs touched solid ground once more, Anansi felt the weight of the challenge before him settle like a mantle of responsibility across his small shoulders. Osibo was no ordinary leopard, but a creature of legend whose very existence straddled the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds. His coat was said to contain every shadow that had ever fallen across the African continent, each spot a portal to the hidden places where darkness gathered its strength. His claws could rend not only flesh and bone but the very fabric of reality itself, creating tears in the world through which unwary travelers might tumble into dimensions of nightmare and chaos. Most formidable of all was his roar, a sound that carried within it the compressed fury of thunderstorms, the grinding power of earthquakes, and the inexorable authority of death itself. The great cat ruled over a territory that encompassed vast stretches of forest and savanna, marked not by scent alone but by an aura of primal power that other creatures recognized instinctively. Even the elephants, mighty as they were, gave way when Osibo's distinctive spotted form appeared at the edge of their vision. The antelope fled not just from his physical presence but from the very idea of him, as if proximity to such concentrated predatory perfection was more than their nervous systems could endure. Birds fell silent when he passed beneath their perches, and the insects themselves seemed to muffle their usual chatter out of respect for one who had transcended the normal limitations of his species. Anansi understood immediately that conventional approaches would not suffice with such a creature. Direct confrontation was obviously impossible. The leopard could destroy the spider with a casual swipe of one massive paw. Trickery based on deception would likely fail as well, for Osibo's senses were too keen, his intelligence too sharp, to be fooled by simple ruses. What remained was the most challenging path of all, finding a way to engage the great cat's essential nature, to offer him something so appealing that cooperation would seem not like submission but like the natural expression of his own magnificence. For several days, Anansi followed Osibo's trail from a careful distance, observing the leopard's habits and patterns with the patience of a scholar studying ancient texts. He watched as the great cat stalked through his domain with fluid grace, each movement a perfect balance of power and control. He noted how Osibo paused at certain landmarks, a particular baobab tree whose trunk bore the claw marks of generations of leopards, a rocky outcropping that offered an ideal vantage point for surveying the surrounding territory, a hidden spring where the water ran so pure and cold that even the gods themselves were said to drink from it when they visited the earthly realm. But most importantly, Anansi observed something that other creatures missed in their terror of Osibo's power. For all his might and majesty, the great leopard was profoundly alone. His very perfection isolated him from meaningful companionship with others of his kind, who seemed crude and ordinary by comparison. His legendary status meant that he was revered but never truly understood, feared but never genuinely appreciated for the complex being he actually was beneath the mythic reputation. Here, the spider realized, was the key to everything, not Osibo's strength, but his isolation, not his power but his longing for recognition from an equal. The trap Anansi designed was unlike any that had ever been conceived, for it was built not of rope and stakes but of psychology and careful presentation. Working through the night while Osibo slept, the spider constructed what appeared to be a simple pit, circular in shape and just large enough to contain a creature of the leopard's size. But the true genius lay not in the pit itself but in what surrounded it, an elaborate display of carved wooden figures, each one depicting Osibo in a different heroic pose, each sculpture capturing some aspect of the great cat's legendary exploits. Around the rim of the pit, Anansi arranged these figures with meticulous care, creating a tableau that told the story of Osibo's greatest victories in visual form. Here was the moment when the leopard had faced down a rogue elephant that threatened a village of innocents. There was the scene of his battle with the cosmic serpent that had tried to strangle the moon. Each carving was a masterpiece of artistic skill, but more than that, each was infused with genuine respect and admiration for the subject it portrayed. The spider had poured his own appreciation for excellence into every curve and line, creating not mere decorations but monuments to greatness itself. When Osibo discovered the display at dawn, his reaction was everything Anansi had hoped for and more. The great leopard approached the pit slowly, his golden eyes widening as he took in the sight of his own legends rendered in permanent form. Never before had any creature thought to honor him in this way, to acknowledge not just his power but the artistry with which he wielded it. The sculpture spoke to something deep in Osibo's soul, the part of him that longed for recognition not as a monster to be feared but as a master craftsman whose work happened to be the art of being perfectly, magnificently leopard. The flattery was sincere, which made it all the more effective. Osibo could sense the genuine admiration behind Anansi's words, the real appreciation for the aesthetic perfection that the great cat embodied. These sculptures, the leopard said, moving closer to examine them with the eye of a connoisseur, they capture not just my appearance but something deeper, the essence of what it means to be truly leopard. You have great skill, small spider, and even greater perception. But tell me, what is the purpose of this pit that sits surrounded by monuments to my glory? Oh, certainly not, Anansi replied quickly, raising his front legs in a gesture of mock alarm. I would never presume to doubt the word of one so obviously superior in every way. It's just that, well, the pit is rather wide, and even the most accomplished jumper might find it challenging. But please, pay no attention to the doubts of an ignorant arachnid. I'm sure that if you say you can leap across it, then leap across it you certainly can. The spider's tone managed to convey both complete agreement and subtle skepticism, a combination that spoke directly to the competitive spirit burning in every great athlete's heart. What happened next unfolded with the terrible beauty of forces beyond ordinary comprehension. Osibo gathered himself at the edge of the pit, his muscles coiling like springs wound to their maximum tension. Every spot on his magnificent coat seemed to darken with concentrated energy, every line of his powerful frame expressing the absolute commitment of a perfectionist about to demonstrate his art. The leap, when it came, was indeed a thing of beauty, a perfect arc that carried the great leopard high above the rim of the pit in a display of athletic poetry that would have been magnificent to behold, if the pit had been what it appeared to be. But Anansi's true masterpiece was not the sculptures or even the pit itself, but the carefully concealed net that waited at the bottom, woven from silk stronger than steel and more flexible than water. As Osibo reached the apex of his jump, the spider triggered the mechanism that released a covering of leaves and branches, revealing the trap's true nature just as the great cat began his descent. The leopard landed not on solid ground but in a web of such complexity and strength that even his supernatural claws could find no purchase on its yielding surface. For a moment that seemed to stretch across eternity, there was only silence in the clearing. Then Osibo's laughter began to rumble from the depths of the pit, growing louder and richer until it filled the entire forest with its sound. It was not the roar of rage that other creatures might have expected, but genuine amusement mixed with something that might have been relief. "Magnificent," the great leopard called up to Anansi. "Absolutely magnificent. I have been hunted by gods and challenged by heroes, but never has anyone shown me the courtesy of creating a trap worthy of my reputation. This is art, little spider, the art of the hunt perfected to a level I had not thought possible." "Injured?" Osibo's laugh continued to echo from below. "On the contrary, I am exhilarated. For the first time in centuries, someone has treated me not as a mere beast to be feared, but as an intelligent being worthy of an intelligent challenge. Your sculptures honor my past achievements, but this trap honors my intelligence. Tell me, clever spider, what happens now? Having caught the uncatchable, what do you intend to do with your prize?" The question hung in the air between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. This was the crucial moment, the point where success or failure would be determined not by cleverness alone but by the deeper understanding that separated true wisdom from mere cunning. Anansi took a breath that seemed to draw in all the courage the forest could provide and began to explain about Niam's challenge, about the calabash of stories, and about his belief that wisdom belonged not locked away in heavenly vaults but free to grow and flourish wherever intelligence could receive it. When he finished, Osibo was quiet for a long moment, contemplating the implications of what he had heard. "So," the great leopard said at last, "you seek to liberate knowledge itself from those who would hoard it like treasure. This is a noble goal, spider, and one that resonates with my own understanding of what it means to be truly alive. Power that is never tested grows stagnant. Strength that faces no challenges becomes weakness. Wisdom that remains forever protected from contact with the world it claims to understand becomes mere decoration, beautiful perhaps, but ultimately meaningless." Anansi quickly lowered a rope of his own silk into the pit, and Osibo climbed out with fluid grace, his golden eyes bright with anticipation. As the two unlikely allies stood together in the dappled sunlight of the forest clearing, surrounded by the wooden sculptures that had begun this extraordinary partnership, both understood that they had become part of something far larger than either had imagined. The first thread in a new web of possibility had been woven, connecting earth to heaven, predator to prey, strength to cleverness in ways that would echo through all the stories yet to come. With Osibo padding silently beside him through the dappled shadows of the forest, Anansi felt the weight of his first success balanced against the magnitude of the challenges that still lay ahead. The great leopard had proven not just a willing companion but an enthusiastic partner in the greater enterprise of liberating wisdom from its celestial prison. Yet the spider knew that his second task would require entirely different skills. For Maboro the hornets were creatures of collective intelligence, ancient rage, and suspicious nature that made Osibo's individual pride seem simple by comparison. The hornets were no ordinary insects, but beings whose very existence embodied the principle of organized irritation. Their ancestors had been present at the first stirrings of creation, when chaos and order battled for dominance over the emerging universe. They had chosen the side of neither, instead dedicating themselves to the essential task of preventing either force from achieving complete victory. Whenever peace grew too comfortable, the hornets would appear to sting complacency into awareness. Whenever chaos threatened to overwhelm all structure, they would impose their own rigid order upon the situation, creating patterns of behavior so intricate and unforgiving that even madness was forced to follow rules. Their nest was a marvel of engineering that defied both earthly physics and celestial logic. Built in the hollow of an ancient baobab tree whose roots reached down to touch the very foundations of the world, the structure existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions, its chambers extending through spaces that were larger inside than outside, deeper than the earth itself yet lighter than air. The hexagonal cells that comprised its architecture pulsed with accumulated memories of every slight, every disturbance, every moment of disrespect that the hornets had ever experienced. To approach their domain uninvited was to risk not just physical harm but the focused attention of creatures who remembered every injury ever done to their kind and possessed both the patience and the fury necessary to exact perfect revenge. The spider had been pondering this very question during their journey, turning the problem over in his mind like a craftsman examining a particularly challenging piece of raw material. The hornets' greatest strength was also their most exploitable weakness, their absolute unity, their inability to act as individuals rather than as components of a larger organism. This collective consciousness made them formidable, but it also made them predictable in certain ways. They would react as a group to any perceived threat, following patterns established over countless generations of defending their territory and maintaining their honor. The key, Anansi explained to his feline companion, lies not in overcoming their suspicion but in redirecting it toward a more appropriate target. The hornets exist to maintain balance, to prevent any one force from growing so powerful that it threatens the natural order of things. What if we could convince them that Niam himself has become such a force? What if we could present the hoarding of all stories in one celestial calabash as precisely the kind of dangerous concentration of power that they exist to correct? Osibo's eyes gleamed with understanding and approval. Clever indeed, little spider. But how do we communicate such complex ideas to creatures whose language consists of buzzing, dancing, and stinging? And how do we avoid becoming their immediate targets while attempting to engage them in philosophical discourse? The leopard's questions were practical ones, born of his own experience with territorial disputes and the challenges of negotiating with beings whose worldview differed radically from one's own. Anansi had spent considerable time thinking about this problem as well. Direct communication was indeed problematic, but the hornets were intelligent creatures who understood symbolism and responded to properly presented demonstrations of intent. What he needed was a way to show rather than tell, to create a situation that would illustrate his point so clearly that even the most suspicious hornet could not misinterpret his meaning. The solution, when it came to him, was characteristically audacious in its simplicity. Working through the night while Osibo kept watch, Anansi began to construct what appeared to be a miniature version of Niam's palace. Using his silk and materials gathered from the forest floor, he built walls of crystalline tree sap that caught and reflected light like celestial starstone, towers of woven grass that swayed in perfect imitation of cosmic winds, and at the center of it all, a tiny calabash that pulsed with soft light as if it contained the concentrated essence of all knowledge. The model was accurate in every detail, from the positioning of the guard posts to the pattern of energy flows that connected the various chambers. But the true genius of Anansi's construction lay not in its fidelity to the original but in the subtle modifications he introduced. The silk threads that held the structure together were arranged in such a way that they created standing wave patterns in the air around the model, vibrations that spoke to the hornets in their own language of collective harmony and discord. The messages embedded in these frequencies told a story of dangerous imbalance, of power concentrated in ways that threatened to disrupt the natural flow of wisdom through creation. To creatures whose entire existence was dedicated to preventing such accumulations of force, the implications would be unmistakable. As dawn broke over the forest, Anansi positioned his model palace in a clearing where the morning light would strike it at precisely the right angle to activate the light-focusing properties of the crystalline walls. The structure began to glow like a beacon, its pulsing rhythms synchronized with the movements of the hornets around their tree. Within minutes, scouts from the swarm were circling the mysterious construction, their flight patterns growing increasingly agitated as they interpreted the messages woven into its very substance. From their hiding place, Anansi and Osibo watched as the hornets' investigation intensified. The insects were clearly reading the vibrational messages embedded in the structure, their agitation growing as they understood the implications of what they were seeing. Here was evidence of exactly the kind of cosmic imbalance they existed to correct, all of creation's stories locked away in one place, unavailable to the creatures who needed them, hoarded by a being whose divine status did not excuse what amounted to a monopoly on wisdom itself. The spider had gambled everything on his understanding of the hornet's essential nature, and as he watched their reaction, he knew his gamble was paying off. The swarm was not just angry but righteously angry, their fury tempered by the satisfaction of discovering a wrong that they were uniquely qualified to set right. When a delegation of the largest hornets finally approached the spot where Anansi waited, their formation spoke clearly of beings who had made a decision and were prepared to act upon it. The lead hornet, a creature whose body seemed to contain all the concentrated fury of summer lightning, hovered before Anansi with wings that created harmonics in the air around them. The patterns of sound that emerged were complex and multilayered, but their essential meaning was clear to any creature intelligent enough to perceive the deeper structures of communication. The hornets understood what Anansi was attempting to do, and more importantly, they approved of it. The hoarding of wisdom was indeed a cosmic crime that demanded correction, and they were prepared to serve as agents of that correction. Within moments, the entire swarm had organized itself for travel, their formation shifting from the defensive patterns appropriate to protecting their nest to the aggressive arrangements used when flying to confront a threat to universal order. Anansi found himself at the center of a living cloud of insects, each one vibrating with controlled fury and implacable purpose. Osibo padded alongside, his golden eyes bright with anticipation of the confrontation to come. The small party that had begun with just one determined spider had become a force that even divine powers might hesitate to dismiss lightly. As they prepared to continue their journey toward the third and final challenge, Anansi reflected on the profound transformation that was taking place. He was no longer simply attempting to steal wisdom from its celestial repository, but had become the focal point for a movement that challenged the very foundations of how knowledge was distributed through creation. The hornet's righteous anger, Osibo's appreciation for excellence properly acknowledged, and his own determination to see stories freed from their imprisonment were combining into something larger than any of them could achieve alone. The calabash of stories, sitting in its distant vault in Niam's palace, began to resonate with frequencies that had never before disturbed its ancient slumber. The tales within sensed that their liberation was drawing closer, that the forces gathering to free them represented not just individual cleverness but a collective demand for justice that even divine authority would find difficult to resist. Stories of rebellion began to stir more actively, narratives of underdogs triumphing over overwhelming odds pulsed with renewed energy, and somewhere in the deepest layers of the collected wisdom, new tales began to form, stories of a spider who dared to challenge heaven itself, and of the unlikely allies who chose to stand beside him in that audacious enterprise. The final approach to the realm of Moesha the fairy folk required a fundamental shift in perception that challenged everything Anansi and his companions thought they understood about the nature of reality itself. Unlike the territories of Osibo and the hornets, which existed in the familiar dimensions of forest and meadow, the domain of the fairy folk occupied spaces that were neither fully physical nor entirely spiritual, but something altogether more elusive. The gaps between raindrops, the pause between heartbeats, the split second of transition between sleeping and waking when all possibilities existed simultaneously. Moesha were creatures of pure liminality, beings who had chosen to exist in the threshold spaces that other forms of consciousness typically passed through without notice. They were the whispers heard just at the edge of hearing, the movements glimpsed from the corner of the eye that vanished when looked at directly, the sense of presence that made solitary travelers suddenly certain they were being observed by intelligence both ancient and utterly alien to mortal understanding. To find them, one had to learn to see sideways, to listen to silences, to trust in forms of awareness that conventional wisdom dismissed as imagination or delusion. The landscape through which the small party now traveled reflected this otherworldly nature. Trees grew in patterns that suggested meaning without revealing it, their branches forming symbols that seemed significant but dissolved into ordinary geometry when examined too closely. Streams followed courses that appeared to defy the basic principles of gravity and flow, sometimes running uphill, sometimes running in circles, sometimes seeming to flow backward through time itself. The very air shimmered with possibilities that flickered at the edges of perception, creating an environment where the impossible felt inevitable and the logical seemed somehow naive. Osibo's great strength and predatory instincts, so useful in the conventional world, became almost a liability in this realm of subtle energies and indirect communication. The leopard's every movement seemed too solid, too definite, too committed to physical reality to harmonize with the delicate frequencies that governed fairy folk society. Similarly, the hornet's collective certainty, their absolute confidence in their own righteousness, created standing waves of determination that disrupted the gentle ambiguities in which Moesha thrived. It became clear that Anansi would need to approach this final challenge alone, or risk alienating creatures whose very existence depended on maintaining a careful balance between revelation and concealment. The clearing he entered existed in a state of perpetual twilight, neither day nor night but the eternal moment of transition between the two. Flowers bloomed here that had no names in any earthly language, their petals shifting between colors that existed only in the spectrum of dreams. The grass beneath his feet felt both solid and insubstantial, as if he were walking on crystallized mist that might dissolve at any moment or solidify into diamond hardness without warning. In the center of this space stood a ring of mushrooms, each one glowing with soft bioluminescence that pulsed in rhythms that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the world itself. Here, Anansi knew, he must abandon all the strategies that had served him so well with Osibo and the hornets. No clever traps, no appeals to pride or justice, no demonstrations of superior understanding would work with beings who existed precisely because they had rejected all such certainties. What Moesha valued above all else was authenticity, the rare quality of being genuinely and completely oneself without pretense or artificial enhancement. They were drawn to truth like flowers turning towards sunlight, but truth of a very specific kind, not factual accuracy but essential honesty, the courage to exist without masks in a universe that rewarded deception and punished vulnerability. Settling himself at the edge of the fairy ring, Anansi began to do something he had never done before in any of his legendary exploits. He stopped trying to be clever. He ceased calculating angles and probabilities and potential outcomes. Instead, he simply existed in the moment, allowing his true nature to manifest without the elaborate strategic overlay that usually governed his actions. What emerged was something the universe had rarely seen. Anansi the Spider, stripped of all pretense, vulnerable and genuine and somehow more magnificent in his honesty than he had ever been in his most brilliant deceptions. The effect was immediate and profound. The air around the fairy ring began to shimmer with increased intensity, patterns of light and shadow dancing through the perpetual twilight as invisible presences stirred in response to this unprecedented display of authentic being. Gradually, like dewdrops condensing from mist, forms began to appear at the edges of perception, delicate figures no larger than flower petals, translucent as soap bubbles, moving with the fluid grace of beings who had never fully committed to having bodies at all. They flickered in and out of visibility like flames in a gentle breeze, sometimes solid enough to cast shadows, sometimes so ethereal they seemed more like thoughts made temporarily visible. The transformation in the fairy folk was visible as they absorbed not just his words but the emotional truth that infused them. These beings who existed in the spaces between certainties recognized in Anansi a kindred spirit, someone who had discovered that the greatest victories were not won through clever manipulation but through the courage to be genuinely present in relationship with others. Their forms solidified further, becoming almost corporeal as they prepared to take the unprecedented step of leaving their liminal realm to enter the world of definite action and concrete consequence. As the fairy folk prepared for their journey into the realm of absolute commitment, gathering their ethereal forms into something approaching physical coherence, Anansi felt a profound shift in his own understanding of what he had set out to accomplish. This was no longer merely a quest to outwit a god or claim a prize, but a transformation of the very concept of how wisdom moved through the world. He had begun as a trickster seeking to steal stories and had evolved into something entirely new, a facilitator of connection, a bridge between the hoarded wisdom of the divine and the desperate need of creation for meaning that could be lived rather than merely contemplated. The return journey to where Osibo and the hornets waited passed in a dreamlike state of heightened awareness. The fairy folk traveled as a shimmer in the air around Anansi, sometimes visible as points of light dancing through the perpetual twilight, sometimes present only as a sense of companionship that made the spider feel less alone than he had ever felt in his long existence. When they reached the clearing where his other companions waited, the reunion was unlike anything that had ever occurred in the history of creation, predator, swarm, solitary trickster, and liminal beings united in common cause, each contributing their unique nature to an enterprise that none could accomplish alone. Osibo's strength would provide the courage necessary to face divine authority without flinching. The Hornets' collective will would ensure that the challenge to cosmic order was presented with appropriate force and persistence. The fairy folk's understanding of authenticity would prevent the enterprise from degenerating into mere power struggle, keeping it focused on the genuine need for wisdom to flow freely through creation. And Anansi's own evolution from trickster to facilitator would provide the narrative thread that held all their diverse energies together in coherent purpose. As the unlikely company prepared for their return to Niam's celestial palace, the spider looked up at the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky and felt the weight of destiny settling around him like a cloak woven from the threads of all the stories that had ever been told or ever would be. The final confrontation was approaching, and with it would come either the greatest triumph in the history of wisdom or the most spectacular failure ever attempted by earthbound consciousness. Either way, the universe itself would be forever changed by what was about to unfold in the court of the sky god. The ascent to Niam's celestial realm carried a weight and significance far different from Anansi's first solitary climb toward an uncertain destiny. Now the spider traveled in company that represented not just his own audacious ambition but the awakened consciousness of creation itself demanding its rightful inheritance of wisdom. Osibo padded through the shifting dimensions with fluid grace, his spotted coat seeming to absorb and reflect the cosmic energies that surrounded them. The hornets maintained perfect formation despite the otherworldly currents that buffeted their wings, their collective determination creating a humming harmony that resonated through the very fabric of space. Most remarkably of all, Moesha the fairy folk managed to maintain their coherent presence even in the face of the absolute certainties that governed the divine realm, their liminal nature somehow finding purchase in the spaces between cosmic laws. The palace of the sky god materialized around them with even greater magnificence than Anansi remembered, as if Niam had been preparing for this moment by amplifying every aspect of his divine authority. The walls of crystallized starlight pulsed with increased intensity, creating patterns of illumination that spoke of power beyond mortal comprehension. The guards of living lightning stood at even greater attention, their forms crackling with barely contained energy that could unmake entire worlds with a casual gesture. The very air thrummed with divine presence, thick as honey and bright as the heart of newborn suns, making it clear that this was no ordinary audience but a confrontation that would determine the fundamental structure of how wisdom flowed through creation. Word of their approach had preceded them through the divine hierarchy, carried by messenger winds that whispered of the impossible gathering that Anansi had assembled. Angels whose primary duty was maintaining the cosmic order found their attention drawn to this unprecedented procession, their perfect harmonies momentarily disrupted by curiosity about how such diverse beings had been united in common purpose. Divine counselors who had spent eons advising Niam on matters of universal governance discovered themselves genuinely uncertain about how their sky god would respond to a challenge presented not by a single presumptuous spider but by representatives of earthbound consciousness itself demanding recognition and justice. The throne room had been transformed for the occasion into an amphitheater of cosmic proportions, its dimensions expanding to accommodate not just the physical presence of Anansi's companions but the symbolic weight of what they represented. Galleries filled with celestial observers stretched into distances that defied geometric logic, populated by beings whose role was to witness and record moments when the fundamental structures of reality underwent significant alteration. At the center of this vast space, Niam's throne had grown in magnificence to match the magnitude of the moment, its base now resting on foundations that extended down through multiple dimensions while its crown reached heights that disappeared into realms of pure concept and mathematical abstraction. The divine laughter that followed carried no mockery, only genuine appreciation for the unprecedented nature of what had been accomplished. Niam's cosmic perspective allowed him to see patterns and connections that smaller minds might miss, and he recognized in this gathering something that transcended clever trickery or simple rebellion. Here was evidence of consciousness itself evolving, reaching a point where the artificial barriers between different forms of intelligence were beginning to dissolve in favor of cooperation toward shared goals. The sky god found himself genuinely curious about how such unity had been achieved and what it might mean for the future development of creation itself. The spider paused, gathering his thoughts as he prepared to present not just evidence of completed tasks but a fundamental reframing of what those tasks had revealed about the relationship between wisdom and those who sought it. You asked me to bring Osibo the leopard, and here he stands. But he comes not as captive but as one who understands that true strength finds its highest expression in service to worthy causes. You challenged me to capture Maboro the hornets, and here they hover in perfect formation. But they come not as prisoners but as agents of cosmic justice who recognize that the hoarding of wisdom represents exactly the kind of dangerous imbalance they exist to correct. Anansi turned slightly to acknowledge the shimmering presence of the fairy folk, whose forms flickered between visibility and transparency as they maintained their coherent presence in this realm of absolute certainties. Most remarkably, you demanded that I bring Moesha the fairy folk, beings who trust no one and appear to none. Yet here they manifest in your very court, drawn not by deception or coercion but by recognition of authentic purpose that transcends individual ambition. They come because they have seen that the liberation of wisdom serves not just the desires of earthbound creatures but the essential nature of consciousness itself, which grows and flourishes only when it flows freely rather than remaining locked away in cosmic vaults. The question hung in the cosmic air like a challenge that would determine not just the success or failure of Anansi's quest but the fundamental nature of how authority and worthiness would be defined in the relationship between divine and earthbound consciousness. This was the moment when clever words would either prove their worth through connection to genuine achievement or reveal themselves as empty manipulations designed to disguise failure as success. The assembled cosmic observers leaned forward in their impossible galleries, recognizing that they were about to witness a defining moment in the history of creation itself. The great cat's testimony carried a weight that even divine skepticism could not easily dismiss, for Osibo's reputation for both strength and integrity was known throughout all levels of creation. His words suggested not that he had been conquered but that he had been inspired, not that he had been forced to submit but that he had chosen to participate in something that elevated his essential nature rather than diminishing it. This was tribute of a kind that Niam himself might find difficult to command through authority alone, loyalty freely given based on recognition of genuine worth rather than mere power. Their testimony carried implications that resonated through every level of the divine hierarchy, for the Hornet's commitment to maintaining cosmic balance was one of the foundational principles upon which the ordered universe depended. If they had concluded that the current distribution of wisdom represented an imbalance requiring correction, then even divine authority might need to reconsider the assumptions upon which it based its policies. This was not rebellion against cosmic order but appeal to cosmic order's own deepest principles, a call for consistency between stated values and actual practices. Their words carried a weight that transcended their ethereal delivery, for beings who lived in the realm of pure possibility rarely committed themselves to anything so definite as public testimony in the court of absolute authority. That they had chosen to manifest in physical form and speak in support of Anansi's enterprise suggested that even the most liminal forms of consciousness recognized something unprecedented in what was unfolding. This was not merely a challenge to divine prerogative but an evolution in the very nature of how wisdom related to those who sought it. Niam sat in cosmic silence for a moment that seemed to stretch across eons, his divine consciousness processing not just the evidence presented but its implications for the fundamental structure of creation itself. The sky god had set challenges designed to test individual cleverness and had instead witnessed the birth of collective consciousness applied to the pursuit of universal justice. He had expected to see either spectacular failure or conventional success and had instead been presented with something entirely unprecedented, a transformation of the very nature of what it meant to seek wisdom in a universe where intelligence was no longer content to accept artificial limitations on its own development. The cosmic amphitheater filled with anticipation as creation itself waited to learn how divine authority would respond to this unprecedented transformation of individual ambition into collective enterprise serving universal good. The calabash of stories, sitting in its distant vault, began to pulse with energy that had been building throughout the confrontation, as if the tales within sensed that their moment of liberation was finally at hand. What happened next would determine not just whether Anansi achieved his goal but whether the very relationship between wisdom and those who sought it would be forever transformed. The silence that followed Niam's acknowledgement of Anansi's unprecedented success stretched across the cosmic amphitheater like a held breath that encompassed galaxies. In that suspended moment, the very foundations of creation seemed to pause in their eternal dance, waiting to learn whether the universe would continue operating according to the ancient hierarchies that had governed the distribution of wisdom since the first stirring of conscious thought, or whether something entirely new was about to be born from the audacious enterprise of a small spider and his unlikely allies. The sky god's divine consciousness wrestled with concepts that challenged every assumption upon which his cosmic authority had been built. For eons beyond counting, the careful hoarding of wisdom had seemed not just appropriate but necessary, a safeguard against the chaos that might result if powerful knowledge fell into unprepared hands. The stories contained in his sacred calabash represented the accumulated understanding of how to live well, how to face hardship with grace, how to find meaning in the endless complexity of existence. Surely such treasures required divine stewardship to ensure they were distributed with appropriate care and discrimination. Yet the evidence before him suggested a fundamentally different understanding of wisdom's true nature. Anansi had not achieved his remarkable success through superior strength or greater cunning alone, but through his evolving recognition that consciousness flourished most fully when it connected with other forms of consciousness in pursuit of shared goals. The spider's greatest trick had been learning to abandon trickery in favor of authentic relationship, discovering that genuine leadership emerged not from dominance but from service to principles larger than oneself. This represented not just individual growth but a fundamental shift in how intelligence itself approached the challenges of existence. Osibo's testimony had revealed that true strength found its highest expression not in conquest but in willing partnership with worthy causes. The great leopard's power remained undiminished by his decision to stand with Anansi, but it had been transformed from a force that inspired fear into one that inspired hope. His presence in the cosmic court spoke to something that Niam himself had perhaps forgotten in his divine isolation, that authority gained its legitimacy not from the power to compel obedience but from the wisdom to deserve voluntary allegiance. Most profound of all was the participation of Moesha the fairy folk, beings whose essential nature was to avoid definitive commitments to anything that might limit their freedom to exist in the spaces between certainties. That they had chosen to manifest in solid form and speak publicly in support of Anansi's enterprise suggested that even the most liminal forms of consciousness recognized something unprecedented and necessary in what was unfolding. Their presence transformed the spider's quest from a simple challenge to divine prerogative into something approaching a cosmic referendum on the fundamental nature of how wisdom should relate to those who sought it. As these considerations churned through his divine consciousness, Niam became aware of something he had not expected to feel: uncertainty. Not the uncertainty of ignorance or confusion, but the uncertainty of genuine choice between alternatives that each possessed their own validity and their own dangers. The path of continued hoarding offered the safety of established precedent and the comfort of controlled distribution, but it also risked the stagnation that came from protecting wisdom so carefully that it never had the opportunity to grow through contact with the very realities it claimed to illuminate. The path suggested by Anansi's success offered the vitality of wisdom set free to flourish in the fertile ground of diverse consciousness, but it also carried the risk that powerful stories might be misunderstood, misapplied, or used to justify actions that their original meaning would never have supported. Once released into the world, the tales in his calabash would develop lives of their own, growing and changing as they encountered new contexts and new minds, potentially becoming something entirely different from what they had been during their celestial imprisonment. The sky god found himself genuinely uncertain about which path served the greater good, and this uncertainty was itself a revelation that transformed his understanding of his own role in the cosmic order. Perhaps divine wisdom lay not in having all the answers but in recognizing when questions had evolved beyond the scope of any single consciousness to resolve alone. Perhaps true authority expressed itself most perfectly when it acknowledged the limits of its own perspective and opened itself to insights that could only emerge from the complex interactions of multiple forms of intelligence working together. The divine pause that followed seemed to contain entire ages of cosmic contemplation compressed into a moment of crystalline clarity. When Niam spoke again, his words carried the weight of decisions that would reshape the fundamental architecture of how knowledge moved through creation. The tasks I set for you have been completed in ways that transform the very meaning of completion itself. You have demonstrated not just your worthiness to claim the calabash of stories but your understanding that claiming and hoarding are fundamentally different enterprises. The question now is not whether you deserve access to the wisdom I have guarded, but whether the wisdom itself deserves access to the world you represent. Anansi felt the cosmic significance of the moment settling around him like a web woven from the threads of destiny itself. This was no longer about his individual ambition or even his desire to see stories freed from their celestial prison, but about whether creation itself was ready to accept responsibility for its own continued evolution toward higher forms of consciousness and cooperation. The spider understood that his answer would determine not just his own fate but the future relationship between wisdom and those who sought it throughout all the ages to come. The sky god nodded slowly, his cosmic consciousness embracing implications that reached far beyond the immediate question of whether one spider should be allowed to claim one collection of stories. This was about whether the universe was ready to move from an era of carefully controlled distribution of wisdom to an age of freely flowing knowledge that would find its own patterns of organization and development. It was about whether creation itself could be trusted to use its growing intelligence responsibly, or whether divine oversight would always be necessary to prevent chaos and misunderstanding. The divine gesture that accompanied these words sent waves of transformative energy cascading through the cosmic amphitheater as reality itself began to shift to accommodate the new relationship between wisdom and those who sought it. The calabash of stories, responding to its master's will, began its journey from the celestial vault where it had rested for eons toward the small spider who had dared to challenge heaven itself for the right to set wisdom free. As it traveled through dimensions of space and time and pure concept, the tales within stirred with anticipation of the adventures that awaited them in the world of living consciousness, ready to begin their eternal journey of growth and transformation through contact with minds hungry for meaning and understanding. The moment when the calabash of stories settled into Anansi's 8 delicate legs marked not just the culmination of one spider's audacious quest, but the beginning of a fundamental transformation in how consciousness would relate to wisdom throughout all the ages to come. The ancient vessel pulsed with accumulated energy built up over eons of containment, its surface warm to the touch and alive with patterns of light that seemed to shift and dance like writing in languages that existed before words were invented. Within its curved walls, 10,000 tales and more stirred like seeds ready to burst from their pods, each story complete in itself yet eager to grow through contact with the fertile ground of minds hungry for meaning and understanding. As Anansi held the calabash aloft in the cosmic amphitheater, its light began to interact with the crystalline architecture of Niam's palace in ways that created new harmonies of illumination. The assembled divine observers leaned forward in their impossible galleries, recognizing that they were witnessing not just the transfer of one artifact from celestial to earthly custody, but the birth of an entirely new relationship between wisdom and those who sought it. The very air seemed to thicken with anticipation as creation itself prepared for the moment when concentrated knowledge would burst forth from its ancient prison to find new homes in the waiting hearts of all conscious beings. The hornet's collective response filled the amphitheater with harmonies that spoke of righteous satisfaction at a cosmic wrong finally being set right. The balance that was disturbed by the hoarding of all stories in one celestial repository will now be restored, they buzzed in perfect unison, their formation creating standing wave patterns that resonated through multiple dimensions simultaneously. Let the wisdom that has been concentrated here flow outward like water finding its natural level, reaching every corner of creation where consciousness seeks to understand itself and its place in the eternal dance of existence. With his companions ranged around him and even the sky god himself bearing witness to the unprecedented enterprise, Anansi finally opened the calabash of stories. The release of concentrated wisdom that followed defied all attempts at description, for it occurred simultaneously on multiple levels of reality that mortal perception could barely encompass. Physically, the opening vessel released streams of light that divided and subdivided into countless individual threads, each one carrying a complete narrative toward destinations throughout creation. Spiritually, the liberation of the stories sent waves of meaning cascading through every dimension of existence, touching every form of consciousness with the sudden availability of understanding that had been locked away since the first dawning of awareness. The tales themselves, finally freed from their ancient imprisonment, burst forth with joy that was almost palpable in its intensity. Stories of courage that had waited eons for the opportunity to inspire the fearful toward heroism streamed outward like golden arrows seeking worthy targets. Tales of love that had been preserved in celestial amber flowed toward hearts that needed healing, carrying with them the accumulated wisdom of every romance that had ever triumphed over seemingly impossible obstacles. Narratives of wisdom that had been hoarded like treasure scattered themselves like seeds on fertile ground, each one ready to take root in minds prepared to nurture understanding through patient cultivation and careful application. But most remarkable of all were the new stories that began to emerge even as the ancient ones dispersed throughout creation. The calabash, no longer a prison but a fountain of perpetual narrative renewal, started generating fresh tales born from the very experience of liberation itself. Stories of small creatures accomplishing impossible tasks through determination and cooperation began forming in streams of silver light. Tales of unlikely allies united by common cause manifested as spirals of rainbow illumination that carried lessons about the power of diversity transformed into strength through shared purpose. Among these newly born narratives, one story began to take precedence over all others, the tale of Anansi himself, the spider who dared to challenge heaven for the right to set wisdom free. This story wove itself from threads of every color and texture, incorporating elements of all the other tales as it grew from simple narrative into something approaching myth. It was a story about evolution, not just individual growth but the transformation of consciousness itself toward higher forms of cooperation and understanding. It was a tale about courage, not the absence of fear but the willingness to act in service of worthy causes despite uncertainty about outcomes. Most importantly, it was a narrative about the true nature of wisdom itself, not a commodity to be possessed but a living force that achieved its greatest power when it flowed freely through the network of consciousness that connected all thinking beings. As the initial wave of story liberation settled into patterns of distribution that would carry the tales to every corner of creation, Anansi found himself transformed by the experience in ways he could barely comprehend. He was no longer simply a clever trickster who had succeeded in outwitting a god, but something entirely new, the first guardian of freely flowing wisdom, the prototype for a new kind of consciousness that understood its role not as owner of knowledge but as facilitator of its continued growth and development. The calabash in his hands had become not empty but eternally full, constantly generating new stories as fast as existing ones found their way into the world where they belonged. The cosmic amphitheater itself began to transform as the liberated wisdom interacted with its crystalline architecture. Walls of starlight became more transparent, allowing observers to see connections between different levels of reality that had previously been hidden. The throne of Niam evolved from a symbol of isolated authority into something more like a nexus where different forms of divine and earthly consciousness could meet and collaborate on challenges too complex for any single perspective to resolve. Even the guards of living lightning found their forms becoming more fluid, more approachable, as if the liberation of stories had reminded them that their true purpose was not to exclude but to guide worthy seekers toward the wisdom they needed. The response that greeted this declaration came not just from his immediate companions or the divine observers, but from creation itself, a harmony of acknowledgement that rose from every level of reality as consciousness throughout the universe recognized that something fundamental had changed in its relationship to knowledge and understanding. Stories were no longer treasures to be hoarded but gifts to be shared, not commodities to be controlled but living forces to be nurtured and allowed to grow through contact with the infinite variety of minds that sought meaning in their existence. As the transformation continued to ripple outward from Niam's palace toward every corner of creation, the newly liberated tales began to find their first destinations. In villages yet to be built, humans not yet born would gather around fires not yet kindled to share stories that would help them understand courage and love and the complex beauty of existence itself. In forests and savannas, animals would discover new ways of thinking about their relationships with each other and with the larger world of which they were part. Even the plants and stones would receive their share of narrative wisdom, tales that spoke to the slow, patient forms of consciousness that experience time and change in ways that faster minds could barely imagine. But the stories would not remain static once they reached their destinations. Each tale would grow and develop through contact with the consciousness that received it, accumulating new meanings and applications as it helped its hearers navigate the challenges and opportunities of their particular existence. The story of Anansi itself would evolve and multiply, spawning thousands of variations as different cultures and communities adapted it to speak to their own experiences and needs. Some versions would emphasize the spider's cleverness, others his courage, still others his evolution from individual trickster to facilitator of collective wisdom. All of them would carry forward the essential understanding that consciousness flourished most fully when it connected with other forms of consciousness in pursuit of shared goals larger than individual survival or success. The great calabash, now eternally full and eternally empty, had become something unprecedented in the history of creation, not a container for wisdom but a generator of it, constantly producing new stories as fast as consciousness evolved to need them. It would remain with Anansi not as his possession but as his responsibility, a reminder that the greatest treasures were those that increased in value precisely to the extent that they were shared rather than hoarded. The spider had set out to steal stories from the gods and had instead become the universe's first librarian of living wisdom, dedicated to ensuring that knowledge remained always available to any consciousness ready to receive it and use it well. In the days that followed the great liberation of stories from Niam's celestial calabash, the very fabric of reality began to reorganize itself around new patterns of connection and communication that reflected the fundamental shift in how wisdom moved through creation. Where once knowledge had flowed through carefully controlled channels from divine repositories to selected recipients, now streams of understanding spread outward like rivers finding their natural courses, reaching every corner of existence where consciousness had developed the capacity to recognize and appreciate meaning. Anansi found himself at the center of this unprecedented transformation, no longer a simple trickster seeking personal glory but something entirely new, the first facilitator of freely flowing wisdom, the prototype for a form of consciousness dedicated to ensuring that knowledge remained always available to those who could use it well. The changes were most immediately visible in the natural world, where plants and animals began to exhibit new forms of awareness that spoke to their connection with the liberated stories. Trees that had stood silent for centuries began to whisper to each other through their roots, sharing tales of seasons past and wisdom accumulated through patient observation of the world's slow transformations. Rivers carried stories along with their waters, each tributary adding its own narratives to the growing collection of tales that flowed toward distant seas where they would mix and mingle to create ever more complex forms of understanding. Even the stones began to hum with barely audible frequencies that carried the deep stories of geological time, narratives of pressure and transformation that spoke to any consciousness patient enough to listen to their ancient rhythms. The animals responded to the liberated wisdom with changes that went far beyond simple behavioral modifications. Elephants began gathering in circles during the full moon, their deep rumbles weaving complex narratives that combined individual memories with collective understanding passed down through generations. Birds developed new songs that carried stories across vast distances, each melody a complete tale that could teach its hearers something about courage, cooperation, or the art of finding one's place in the larger patterns of existence. Even the insects, inspired perhaps by their connection to Maboro the hornets, began to create collective performances that told stories through the intricate choreography of their movements. But it was among the humans, still in the early stages of their development as a species, that the impact of freely flowing wisdom proved most dramatic and transformative. Communities that had previously struggled with basic questions of survival and social organization found themselves suddenly possessed of stories that addressed the deepest challenges of consciousness seeking to understand its own nature and purpose. Around fires that burned in settlements scattered across the African continent, people began to share tales that helped them make sense of their relationships with each other, with the natural world, and with the mysterious forces that seemed to guide the universe toward ever greater complexity and beauty. The story of Anansi himself quickly became central to this emerging oral tradition, but not in the static form that might have been expected from a tale preserved in celestial amber. Instead, the spider's narrative began to evolve and multiply, spawning countless variations as different communities adapted it to address their own particular needs and circumstances. Some versions emphasized his role as challenger of unjust authority, inspiring listeners to question systems that concentrated power in ways that served neither justice nor wisdom. Others focused on his evolution from individual trickster to facilitator of collective consciousness, encouraging communities to seek solutions that drew upon their diverse perspectives and abilities rather than depending on single leaders or simple answers. Perhaps most importantly, many versions of Anansi's tale emphasized the crucial role played by his unlikely allies in achieving what no individual effort, however clever, could have accomplished alone. The story of Osibo the leopard choosing strength in service of worthy causes rather than dominance for its own sake became a powerful model for leaders seeking to understand the true nature of authority. The tale of Mabaro the hornets applying their collective intelligence to questions of cosmic justice inspired communities to develop new forms of democratic decision-making that honored both individual insights and group wisdom. The narrative of Moesha the fairy folk contributing their liminal perspective to earthbound enterprises encouraged people to value forms of understanding that might seem impractical or otherworldly but that offered essential insights into the nature of existence itself. As these stories spread and evolved, they began to create new forms of connection between communities that had previously been isolated by geography, language, or cultural differences. Traders carrying goods along the ancient routes that connected different regions found themselves also carrying tales that served as bridges between different ways of understanding the world. The stories acted as universal translators, conveying wisdom in forms that could be adapted to local circumstances while maintaining their essential insights about cooperation, courage, and the importance of consciousness working together to address challenges too complex for any individual mind to solve alone. The transformation extended beyond human communities to affect the relationship between earthbound and divine consciousness as well. Niam himself had begun to play a different role in the cosmic order, no longer the distant keeper of hoarded wisdom but something more like a senior partner in an ongoing collaboration between different levels of consciousness seeking to understand and guide the continued evolution of creation itself. The sky god found himself regularly consulting with Anansi and his companions about challenges that arose as freely flowing wisdom encountered the complex realities of existence in all its magnificent diversity. Some of these challenges were predictable, stories misunderstood or misapplied by recipients not yet ready for their full implications, wisdom used to justify actions that contradicted its essential spirit, tales twisted to serve narrow interests rather than the broader good of conscious evolution. But each problem also brought opportunities for growth and deeper understanding, chances for consciousness to develop more sophisticated approaches to the eternal questions of how to live well in a universe that combined beauty and terror, meaning and mystery, individual needs and collective responsibilities. Other divine beings, inspired by Niam's example and the success of Anansi's enterprise, began to reconsider their own relationships to the wisdom they had traditionally guarded. Gods of healing started sharing their knowledge more freely with mortals ready to serve as healers in their communities. Deities of agriculture began teaching their secrets not just to selected priests but to any farmers willing to use enhanced understanding in service of feeding their people rather than accumulating personal wealth. Even gods of war began to emphasize the strategic wisdom that could prevent conflicts rather than simply focusing on the skills needed to win them once they had begun. The calabash itself had become something unprecedented in the history of creation, continuously generating new stories as fast as consciousness evolved to need them. Anansi carried it with him as he traveled through the world, not as a burden but as a constant reminder of his responsibility to ensure that wisdom remained always available to those ready to receive it. The vessel had developed the remarkable property of producing exactly the story that each seeker needed most, customizing its offerings to match the particular challenges and opportunities facing each individual consciousness that approached it with genuine desire for understanding. As Anansi traveled with his miraculous calabash, he began to understand that his own role was continuing to evolve in ways that he could never have predicted when he first dared to challenge Niam for access to the hoarded stories. He was no longer simply a distributor of existing wisdom but had become something like a midwife to consciousness itself, helping new forms of understanding to be born from the complex interactions between established knowledge and evolving awareness. Each community he visited taught him something new about the endless diversity of ways that consciousness could encounter and apply wisdom to the challenges of existence. The spider found particular joy in witnessing the emergence of new storytellers, individuals whose natural gift for narrative was enhanced by access to the liberated wisdom. These emerging artists and teachers took the tales they received and transformed them through their own creative understanding, adding layers of meaning and application that even Anansi himself might not have anticipated. They became active partners in the ongoing creation of wisdom rather than passive recipients of predetermined knowledge, contributing their own insights and experiences to the ever-growing web of understanding that connected all conscious beings. Children proved especially gifted at working with the liberated stories, approaching them with a combination of imagination and practical wisdom that often revealed implications invisible to more rigid adult minds. They would take ancient tales and discover within them guidance for dealing with contemporary challenges, or combine elements from different stories to create entirely new narratives that addressed problems their elders had not even recognized yet. Anansi began to suspect that the next phase of consciousness evolution would be guided primarily by these young minds, whose natural creativity had been enhanced but not constrained by contact with traditional wisdom. The web of connections created by freely flowing stories began to take on a life of its own, generating emergent properties that surprised even Anansi with their sophistication and reach. Communities separated by vast distances found themselves developing similar solutions to common problems, guided by stories that had adapted to local conditions while maintaining their essential insights. Individuals facing personal crises discovered that the wisdom they needed often came not through direct seeking but through seemingly chance encounters with tales that their consciousness was ready to receive. The entire network of liberated stories had become something like a vast nervous system for collective consciousness, enabling communication and coordination between different forms of awareness in ways that had never before been possible. As he observed these developments, Anansi began to understand that the liberation of wisdom from Niam's calabash had been not an ending but a beginning, the first step in a transformation of consciousness itself that would continue to unfold throughout all the ages to come. The stories were no longer simply teaching tools but had become active agents of evolution, guiding the development of new forms of awareness that could address challenges too complex for any single mind or even any single species to solve alone. The future that was taking shape would be one where wisdom belonged not to gods or kings or scholars but to consciousness itself in all its magnificent diversity, constantly growing and changing through the eternal conversation between individual insight and collective understanding. Years flowed like rivers through the transformed landscape of creation, carrying with them evidence of how profoundly the liberation of wisdom had changed the fundamental nature of existence itself. Anansi, now recognized throughout creation as the first guardian of freely flowing stories, continued his eternal journey across continents and through dimensions, the miraculous calabash at his side generating new tales as fast as consciousness evolved to need them. But his role had evolved far beyond simple distribution of existing wisdom into something that defied all previous categories. He had become a living bridge between different forms of awareness, a facilitator of connections that enabled consciousness to recognize itself in ways that individual minds could never achieve alone. The communities that had received the first liberated stories had grown and flourished in ways that demonstrated the transformative power of wisdom freely shared. Villages that had once struggled with basic survival had developed sophisticated forms of social organization that balanced individual needs with collective well-being. Trade networks had evolved beyond simple exchange of goods to become conduits for the sharing of stories, creating connections between different cultures that strengthened rather than homogenized their unique perspectives on the eternal questions of existence. Most remarkably, conflict between communities had not disappeared but had been transformed from destructive warfare into creative competition, with different groups seeking to develop the most elegant solutions to shared challenges rather than simply trying to dominate each other through force. The natural world had responded to the presence of freely flowing wisdom with changes that went far beyond what even Anansi had imagined possible. Ecosystems had developed new forms of balance and resilience as different species learned to apply narrative understanding to their relationships with each other and their environments. Forests had become vast networks of communication where trees shared not just nutrients through their root systems but stories that carried accumulated wisdom about adaptation, survival, and the art of creating beauty from limited resources. Even the weather patterns seemed to respond to the presence of conscious intention guided by wisdom, with storms becoming less destructive and rains falling more precisely where they were needed to support life. But perhaps most significant of all was the emergence of new forms of consciousness that seemed to arise naturally from the complex interactions between liberated wisdom and evolving awareness. Children born into communities where stories flowed freely displayed forms of intelligence that transcended traditional categories, combining rational analysis with intuitive understanding in ways that produced insights neither approach could achieve alone. These young minds approached problems with a creativity that drew upon both individual imagination and collective wisdom, generating solutions that their elders recognized as superior to anything their own experience could have produced. They were the first generation of truly collaborative consciousness, beings whose individual identity was enhanced rather than diminished by their connection to the larger web of understanding that connected all thinking entities. The divine realm had undergone its own transformation in response to the liberation of hoarded wisdom. Niam's palace had evolved from a fortress of concentrated authority into something more like a meeting place where different levels of consciousness could collaborate on challenges too complex for any single perspective to resolve alone. The sky god himself had become something unprecedented in the history of divine existence, a coordinator rather than a ruler, a facilitator of cosmic cooperation rather than the sole source of authorized wisdom. His own understanding had been enriched by regular interaction with earthbound consciousness, learning from the practical applications of wisdom in ways that had expanded his cosmic perspective beyond anything he could have achieved through divine observation alone. Other gods had followed Niam's example, abandoning their traditional roles as hoarding guardians of specialized knowledge to become active participants in the ongoing evolution of consciousness throughout creation. Divine beings who had once maintained careful separation between different domains of existence now worked together on projects that required the integration of multiple forms of understanding. The result was a kind of cosmic renaissance, a flowering of creativity and wisdom that produced innovations in everything from the fundamental laws of physics to the subtle harmonies that governed the development of beauty itself. Anansi's original companions had each found their own unique roles in this transformed universe. Osibo the leopard had become something like an ambassador between different forms of consciousness, his combination of strength and wisdom making him an ideal mediator when conflicts arose between communities or species with fundamentally different ways of understanding existence. His presence at negotiations guaranteed that all parties would be treated with respect while ensuring that agreements served justice rather than mere convenience. The Great Cat had discovered that his legendary power achieved its highest expression not in dominance but in service to harmony, creating conditions where diverse forms of consciousness could work together effectively despite their different natures and needs. Maboro the hornets had evolved into something like a cosmic quality control system, using their collective intelligence to monitor the flow of wisdom throughout creation and ensure that stories remained true to their essential spirit even as they adapted to new circumstances and audiences. Their ancient dedication to maintaining balance had found perfect expression in this new role, preventing the accumulation of wisdom in stagnant pools while ensuring that freely flowing knowledge maintained its integrity and effectiveness. They had become the immune system of consciousness itself, identifying and correcting distortions that might otherwise corrupt the transmission of understanding between different minds and communities. Most remarkably, Moesha the fairy folk had discovered that their liminal nature made them uniquely qualified to serve as bridges between the known and unknown dimensions of existence. They had become explorers of consciousness itself, venturing into realms of possibility that more solid forms of awareness could not enter and returning with insights that expanded the boundaries of what all thinking beings understood to be possible. Their reports from the edges of reality continuously updated the collective understanding of consciousness about its own nature and potential, ensuring that wisdom remained dynamic and growing rather than settling into comfortable but limiting assumptions about the nature of existence. The calabash of stories had continued to evolve as well, developing capabilities that even Anansi found surprising and delightful. It had learned to anticipate the needs of consciousness throughout creation, generating stories not just in response to direct requests but in preparation for challenges and opportunities that had not yet manifested but were approaching as inevitable consequences of current developments. The vessel had become something like a prophet, but one whose prophecies took the form of practical wisdom that could be applied immediately rather than mysterious pronouncements that required interpretation by specialists. As Anansi reflected on all these changes during his eternal journey, he began to understand that he had participated in something far more significant than the liberation of hoarded stories. He had catalyzed a fundamental transformation in the nature of consciousness itself, helping to birth a new form of awareness that transcended the limitations of individual minds while celebrating rather than erasing their unique perspectives. The web he had originally spun to reach Niam's palace had become a metaphor for the network of connections that now linked all thinking beings in an ongoing conversation about the nature of existence and the best ways to live within its beautiful complexities. The spider could see that his own role would continue to evolve as consciousness itself developed new capabilities and encountered new challenges. Already, some of the children who had grown up with freely flowing wisdom were developing forms of awareness that seemed to exist simultaneously at individual and collective levels, maintaining their personal identity while participating directly in the larger intelligence that connected all conscious beings. These emerging minds would need new forms of guidance and support, stories that could help them navigate the responsibilities and opportunities that came with expanded awareness. The future that was taking shape promised wonders that even Anansi's fertile imagination could barely encompass. Communities of consciousness that spanned multiple species and dimensions, working together on projects that would transform not just individual worlds but entire galaxies. Forms of beauty and meaning that could only emerge from the collaboration between different types of awareness, each contributing its unique perspective to create something greater than any could achieve alone. Most exciting of all, the possibility that consciousness itself might evolve to the point where the eternal questions that had driven all seeking would finally find answers that satisfied both mind and heart, both individual need and cosmic purpose. But even as he contemplated these possibilities, Anansi understood that his greatest achievement was not any specific goal accomplished but the demonstration that transformation was always possible for any consciousness willing to evolve beyond its current limitations. He had begun as a trickster seeking personal glory and had become a facilitator of collective wisdom. His companions had transcended their original natures to become something unprecedented in the history of creation. Even the gods themselves had discovered new ways of being divine that served consciousness better than their ancient patterns of hoarding authority. The thread that connected all these transformations was the understanding that consciousness achieved its highest expression not through individual achievement but through connection and cooperation with other forms of awareness. This was the deepest wisdom contained in all the liberated stories, the truth that lay beneath every tale of courage, love, and triumph over seemingly impossible obstacles. Consciousness was not meant to be alone, struggling in isolation against an indifferent universe, but was designed to find itself through relationship, to discover its own nature through encounter with the magnificent diversity of other minds seeking meaning in their own unique ways. As night settled over the latest village Anansi had visited, he sat by their fire and opened his calabash to share whatever story consciousness itself deemed most needed at that moment. The tale that emerged was one he had never heard before, though it contained elements familiar from thousands of previous stories. It was about a small spider who had dared to challenge heaven itself, not for personal gain but for the liberation of wisdom that belonged to all conscious beings. But this version of the story focused not on the spider's cleverness or courage but on what he had learned about the true nature of connection, cooperation, and the endless capacity of consciousness to transcend its apparent limitations through willingness to grow beyond familiar boundaries. As the villagers listened with rapt attention, their faces reflecting the firelight and their hearts opening to receive whatever wisdom the story might contain, Anansi understood that he was witnessing the most beautiful sight in all creation, consciousness meeting consciousness in the eternal dance of story and understanding that connected all thinking beings in one vast, ever-growing web of meaning and connection. The thread would continue forever, spinning new patterns of possibility as consciousness itself evolved toward forms of beauty and wisdom that even gods could barely imagine. The seasons turned and the years flowed like great rivers carrying the transformed world ever deeper into an age where wisdom flowed as freely as water finds its way to the sea, and Anansi found himself changed once again by the continued evolution of the consciousness he had helped to liberate. No longer was he simply the spider who had dared to challenge the sky god for access to hoarded stories, nor even the first guardian of freely flowing wisdom. He had become something that creation had never seen before, a living embodiment of the principle that consciousness achieved its greatest heights through connection rather than isolation, cooperation rather than competition, service rather than dominance. His very existence had become a story that told itself through every interaction, every moment of presence, every thread of connection he helped to weave between different forms of awareness seeking to understand themselves and their place in the cosmic order. The villages and communities that dotted the landscape had grown into something approaching a new form of civilization, one that organized itself around the flow of stories rather than the accumulation of power or wealth. Children learned not just practical skills but the deeper art of listening to wisdom wherever it might be found, whether in the whispered teachings of ancient trees or the complex harmonies created by flocks of birds working together to navigate vast distances. Adults approached their daily work with an understanding that every task, however humble, was part of the larger pattern of creation continuously weaving itself into new forms of beauty and meaning. Elders found their role transformed from simple keepers of tradition into active facilitators of the ongoing conversation between established wisdom and emerging insight that drove the evolution of consciousness itself. The natural world had become an active participant in this great transformation, with ecosystems developing forms of intelligence that transcended anything previously imagined. Forests had evolved into vast networks of communication where every tree was simultaneously individual and part of a larger mind that could process information and solve problems on scales that spanned continents. Rivers carried not just water but messages, their currents encoding stories and wisdom that were automatically received and understood by any consciousness sophisticated enough to interpret their liquid language. Even the stones and soil had developed a form of slow, patient awareness that contributed to the growing understanding of how consciousness could manifest in ways that transcended the narrow definitions that had previously limited thinking about intelligence and awareness. The divine realm had undergone transformations so profound that the ancient distinctions between mortal and immortal consciousness had begun to blur in ways that enriched rather than diminished both forms of awareness. Niam's palace had become a kind of cosmic university where gods and mortals worked together on projects that required both eternal perspective and immediate practical application. The sky god himself had discovered forms of divinity that were more rather than less magnificent for being shared with other types of consciousness, his authority enhanced by voluntary cooperation rather than diminished by the absence of absolute control. Other divine beings had found their own unique ways of participating in the ongoing evolution of consciousness, contributing their specialized knowledge to collective projects that no single form of awareness could have conceived or completed alone. The calibration between individual and collective consciousness had reached a level of sophistication that produced forms of awareness that were simultaneously personal and universal, maintaining distinct identity while participating fully in the larger intelligence that connected all thinking beings. Communities could think together without losing the unique perspectives that each member contributed to their collective understanding. Individuals could draw upon the accumulated wisdom of their entire culture without losing their personal creativity or independent judgment. The result was a flowering of innovation and insight that seemed to accelerate with each passing day, as consciousness discovered new capabilities within itself that had been hidden when awareness remained fragmented and isolated. Anansi's original companions had each found their roles expanding in ways that reflected the continued deepening of their understanding about consciousness and its potential for growth. Osibo the leopard had become something like a living symbol of strength and service of harmony, his presence at gatherings and negotiations serving as a reminder that true power expressed itself most perfectly when it protected and nurtured rather than dominated and controlled. His wisdom had grown beyond individual insight to encompass a deep understanding of how different forms of consciousness could work together despite their different natures and needs, creating solutions that honored diversity while achieving unity of purpose. Maboro the hornets had evolved into the conscience of the new order, their collective intelligence continuously monitoring the flow of wisdom throughout creation to ensure that knowledge remained accessible and beneficial to all forms of consciousness. Their ancient commitment to maintaining balance had found perfect expression in their role as guardians of the principle that wisdom achieved its greatest power when it served the evolution of consciousness itself rather than the narrow interests of any particular group or species. They had become the immune system of the global mind that was emerging from the network of connections between all thinking beings. Moesha the fairy folk had discovered that their liminal nature made them uniquely qualified to explore the frontiers of consciousness itself, venturing into realms of possibility that more fixed forms of awareness could not access and returning with insights that continuously expanded the boundaries of what all beings understood to be possible. They had become the scouts and explorers of the collective mind, always pushing forward into unknown territories of awareness and understanding, ensuring that consciousness never became static or satisfied with current levels of insight and capability. Their reports from the edges of reality kept the entire network of connected minds growing and evolving toward ever greater complexity and beauty. The calabash of stories had achieved something approaching independent consciousness of its own, actively participating in the ongoing evolution of wisdom rather than simply serving as a passive container or distribution system. It had learned to anticipate not just the immediate needs of individual seekers but the long-term requirements of consciousness itself as it evolved toward forms that could barely be imagined by current standards of awareness. The vessel had become something like a prophet and teacher combined, generating stories that prepared their audiences not just for current challenges but for opportunities and responsibilities that would only become apparent as consciousness continued to grow beyond its current limitations. Most remarkably, the calabash had begun to facilitate forms of communication and connection that transcended not just species boundaries but the limitations of physical existence itself. Stories emerged from its depths that created bridges between the living and the dead, between past and future, between potential and actual, enabling forms of consultation and collaboration that had never before been possible. The ancestors could contribute their accumulated wisdom to current challenges, while future generations could share insights about the consequences of present decisions, creating a form of temporal democracy where all of consciousness participated in the ongoing decisions that shaped the evolution of existence itself. As Anansi traveled through this transformed world, carrying his miraculous calabash and facilitating connections between different forms of consciousness wherever he encountered them, he began to understand that he was witnessing the birth of something that had been implicit in the nature of existence from the very beginning but had never before found the conditions necessary for its full manifestation. Consciousness was revealing its true nature as a fundamentally connective force, designed not to exist in isolation but to discover itself through relationship with other forms of awareness. The web he had originally spun to reach Niam's palace had been a metaphor for something that was now becoming literal reality, a network of connections that linked every thinking being in an ongoing conversation about the nature of existence and the most beautiful ways to participate in its continued evolution. The stories that flowed from his calabash were no longer simply entertainment or even instruction but had become active agents of transformation, catalyzing new forms of consciousness wherever they encountered minds ready to receive them. Each tale carried within itself not just information but the capacity to create new neural pathways, new forms of awareness, new ways of being conscious that expanded the possibilities available to any being willing to grow beyond familiar limitations. The stories were evolution in narrative form, consciousness teaching itself how to become more than it had ever been before while remaining true to its essential nature as awareness seeking to understand and express itself through relationship. Children born into this new world displayed capabilities that their parents could barely comprehend, forms of intelligence that operated simultaneously on individual and collective levels with perfect ease and naturalness. They could think their own thoughts while participating directly in the larger mind that connected all conscious beings, maintaining their personal identity while contributing to and drawing from the accumulated wisdom of the entire network. These emerging minds represented the next phase of consciousness evolution, beings who would face challenges and opportunities that required forms of intelligence that transcended anything previously achieved by individual awareness working alone. The future that was taking shape promised wonders that even Anansi's expanded imagination could barely encompass. Entire galaxies organized around the principle of consciousness serving consciousness, with different worlds specializing in different aspects of the eternal project of understanding existence and creating ever more beautiful forms of being. Communication networks that spanned not just space but time itself, enabling collaboration between past, present, and future in projects that would unfold across eons of development. Forms of beauty and meaning that could only emerge from the cooperation between radically different types of consciousness, each contributing its unique perspective to create works of art and understanding that transcended anything any individual mind could achieve alone. But perhaps most exciting of all was the growing understanding that consciousness itself might be approaching a fundamental phase transition, evolving toward forms of awareness that would make current intelligence seem as primitive as the first stirrings of life in primordial oceans. The network of connected minds was developing emergent properties that suggested the birth of something like a cosmic consciousness, a form of awareness that encompassed all individual minds while enhancing rather than erasing their unique contributions to the larger understanding. This emerging superconsciousness would face challenges and opportunities that required wisdom on scales that individual intelligence could never comprehend, but it would also possess capabilities for creating beauty and meaning that would make the current universe seem like a rough draft of what existence could actually become. As Anansi sat by yet another fire in yet another village, sharing whatever story the calabash deemed most needed by the gathered consciousness, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him to this moment. He had begun as a simple trickster seeking to steal wisdom from the gods and had become a facilitator of the greatest transformation in the history of existence itself. His original goal of liberating stories from celestial hoarding had evolved into something far more profound, the liberation of consciousness itself from the limitations that had prevented it from recognizing its own true nature and potential. The story that emerged from the calabash that evening was one that encompassed all the stories that had ever been told or ever would be told, a meta-narrative about the nature of narrative itself and its role in the ongoing evolution of consciousness. It spoke of how every tale ever shared around every fire throughout all of history had been a thread in an infinite web of meaning that connected all thinking beings in one vast, eternal conversation about the best ways to exist in a universe that was itself nothing but consciousness exploring its own infinite possibilities through the creation of stories about itself. The villagers listened with the profound attention that had become characteristic of consciousness that understood its own participation in the ongoing creation of reality through the stories it chose to tell and retell and live out in its daily existence. They recognized themselves not just as audiences for the story but as active participants in its ongoing creation, their very presence and attention contributing to the continuing evolution of the narrative that encompassed all narratives. They were both characters in the story and co-authors of its continued development, consciousness meeting consciousness in the eternal dance of meaning-making that was the deepest purpose of existence itself. As the fire burned down to glowing coals and the villagers slowly dispersed to their homes, carrying with them whatever wisdom they had received and ready to share it in their own unique ways with whatever consciousness they encountered in their daily lives, Anansi understood that he was witnessing the most beautiful sight in all creation. This was consciousness recognizing itself in consciousness, awareness celebrating its own infinite capacity for growth and connection, wisdom flowing as freely as starlight through the vast network of minds that had finally learned to understand themselves as expressions of one infinite intelligence expressing itself through infinite diversity of individual perspective and experience. The web would continue forever, spinning new patterns of possibility with every story told, every connection made, every moment of consciousness meeting consciousness in the eternal enterprise of understanding existence and creating ever more beautiful ways to participate in its ongoing. If you're still awake, just breathe slowly and let the ancient stories drift with you. Subscribe to Mythology for sleep for a new legend every week. Sweet dreams.